Okay. All right, welcome everyone. As we give people a moment to get connected, to get their audios and videos set up, if you want to type in the chat where you're calling in from today, I always enjoy seeing where people are joining us from. And we'll get started in just one more minute after we give people a chance to connect their technology. Number of Washington, D.C. folks today. Okay, well, we've got a lot to dive into, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on combating anti-Semitism, where to start. If you've been following the news over the past few weeks and months, you've likely seen that there's been an increase in anti-Semitic incidents and attacks, particularly in the US and Europe. And that's something that's really concerning. And I'm glad we've got the opportunity today to learn more about anti-Semitism, where it came from, and how to combat it in really practical ways. My name is Sarah Sturm. I'm on the Telos team in Washington, D.C., but I'm speaking to you today from Vermont. For those of you who are joining us for a Telos event for the first time, the Telos Group's an American nonprofit based in DC, and our mission is to form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. Today we have the privilege of being joined by Rabbi Margo Hughes-Robinson. She's the New York organizer at Trua, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. Margo was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she also earned a master's in Midrash scriptural interpretation and served for 2 years as the program coordinator at the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. In addition to her work at Trua, Margo often teaches about anti-Semitism and its intersection with other human rights issues in a variety of settings, including synagogues, university student groups, and not-profit organizations like Telos here today. To give you a run through of our plan for today before I hand it over to Margo, we'll start with a brief historical overview focused primarily on the US context. I know sometimes when we talk about anti-Semitism, we start, centuries ago, and then we don't always get the specifics on American history of anti-Semitism, which is really important to understand. We'll then move to talking about tools to identify and resist anti-Semitism, both personally and structurally. And then there will be time at the end for some question and answers with Rabbi Margo directly. If, as we're talking and we're learning from Rabbi Margo, a question comes up for you, I'd invite you to type it into the chat. And when we get to the question and answer, I'll either ask it or invite you to unmute yourself and ask it yourself, depending on how time is going. So one last thing before I hand it over to Rabbi Margo, I just want to say 2 things about how I'm approaching this webinar today and invite you to join me in them. So 2 of Telos's practices of peacemaking are 1, listening to understand, and then 2, self-interrogate and advocate. And I'll just say something brief about both of them. With listening understand, before we can hope to heal our world, we must first learn to see it how it actually is. If we want to combat anti-Semitism today, it's really important to understand the historical context modern anti-Semitism comes from and the ways our communities maybe have been complicit in anti-Semitism in the past. And the second part, self-interrogate and advocate, recognizes that peacemaking is both an internal and an external practice. As we approach learning about anti-Semitism, how to combat anti-Semitism, it's an opportunity for us to self-interrogate where our communities and our contexts have maybe wittingly or unwittingly participated in perpetuating anti-Semitism. And it's an invitation to advocate within those communities and spaces. The reason I bring that up specifically is as someone who is German and Lutheran, it's been really important for me to understand the context I'm stepping into, the ways my communities have been complicit in anti-Semitism historically, and the opportunities I have today to work to combat anti-Semitism within those spaces. So all that said, I now hand it over to Rabbi Margo, and I'm excited to learn from you today.
Thank you so much for having me, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to share some space and do some learning together. So the first thing I want to talk about before we dig into our analysis, I want to make sure we're grounded in some history and some common terms, right? A lot easier to have a shared conversation when we know what we mean by what we say. So I'm going to use a number of different words to refer to the historic and current discrimination against hatred of Jewish people, the religion of Judaism. So you may hear me use words like Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, Judenhass, which is a German word. The term anti-Semitism actually didn't kind of enter into our discourse until the modern era. While this problem has much, much longer roots, the term anti-Semitism was actually invented by a group of German racial scientists, in huge air quotes, obviously, right? This was like racist science, not really based in scientific principles about whether or not there were intrinsic characteristics that could be described to ethnic or religious or racial groups. And so a German man named Wilhelm Marr in the 1850s sort of originated this term anti-Semitism. And the idea was they wanted to replace the older German word Judenhass, Jew hatred, with something that sounded more sophisticated, more scientific, right? They were using the language of science in order to obscure the hatred that they were engaging in, to try to kind of put it under this mask of scientific inquiry, saying there's a reason why we have this rather than recognizing it as a problem and unpacking it. So it's actually a relatively new term. But Jew hatred, the hatred of Jews, has existed almost as long as there was an acknowledged group of Jewish people existing in the world. We have early Greek writing, early Ptolemaic Egyptian writing talking about not just religious, but also what we might call today, even though these terms, again, originated much later, ethnic or racial stereotypes of Jews, certain what we might call today national concerns about Jewish people. So this has been around a long time. When Jew hatred came into a more global consciousness and began to be really like legislated, not just part of public discourse, but appear in legislation, comes much more to a head in the early medieval period with the rise and consolidation of the church, as well as a bit later in the Muslim world and the Middle East and North Africa. So just to give us some grounding of sort of where this pops up in the American context, often American anti-Semitism, American Jew hatred is really contrasted with Middle East or North African instances of Jew hatred or European Jew hatred, in that in some ways, right, America is a newer nation, although a lot of people have been living in this land for a lot of time. And so there's sort of a number of different schools of thought. Some folks have argued that anti-Semitism is a more recent phenomenon that didn't really bubble up until the 19th century in the US. But there are other scholars, and I tend to subscribe to this view, right, that it's sort of baked in to a lot of the early United States community as well. The first Jewish community to arrive in what is now known as the United States, or what was in North America, Turtle Island, was a group of Jews from Recife, Brazil. Many of these folks had fled the Spanish Inquisition when it spread to what is now modern day Portugal, come to Brazil. The Inquisition had spread to Portuguese colonies in Brazil, and so they came to the United States, this Recife colony of Sephardi Jews. That's not completely what our community in the United States today looks like, right? Jews, really important to keep in mind. We are a multi-ethnic, a multiracial, a multilingual community. That's sort of the first moment where an organized Jewish community showed up in what is today the United States. So there were there are different moments in sort of the history of colonial America that there were pockets, depending on certain states, especially most famously in Maryland, concerns about Jews being able to move or not, settle or not in colonies. But by the time the United States was sort of settled and conglomerated, right, as inaugurated is a nicer word, as a country, George Washington very famously had some correspondence with the Jewish community of Rhode Island. Really where this starts to pop up in not just sentiment, but legislation is during the American Civil War, when Ulysses S. Grant issued a general order, which was rescinded by Abraham Lincoln, but did stand for some time, of expulsion of Jews from portions of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. So So that was sort of the first time that it bubbled up into national legislation, what's now the United States. Since then, anti-Semitism, like a lot of different political, I'm hesitant to call it a political movement, but often anti-Semitism corresponds with different, especially populist political movements. We'll talk about why a bit later, but where it starts appearing again and where we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it is, like I said earlier, starting in the 19th century and the 20th century, probably some events that we are going to go over later and might be a little bit more familiar for, but that's a little bit of the background. One other piece before we dive into dimensions of Jew hatred that feels really important for me to share with you is the notion of interstitiality. Interstitial meaning, the thing in between. One thing that makes anti-Semitism sometimes harder to identify and harder to track if we're used to understanding other forms of systemic discrimination, oppression, is thinking about, often we think of oppression as kind of a top-down thing, or discrimination or hatred as a top-down thing, right? The goal is unidirectional, and it's to push a group of people down or denigrate them. Anti-Semitism functions by placing Jews in an interstitial position, and it's also, in some way, it's circular. So Jews are always kind of moving, or anti-Semitism moves Jews and Jewish communities proximate or less proximate to places of power, depending on the historical moment. The sort of helpful archetype, although it's not super historically grounded, but I think a helpful way of thinking about this actually comes from the sort of the medieval European stereotype of the Jewish tax collector. If we imagine for a minute that we are European peasants, if I'm a European serf, right, I can't leave my land, excuse me, I'm bound to my land, and someone is collecting taxes on behalf of my local lord or king, often, right, the Jewish community, Jewish individuals were put in that position of tax collector, or at least we think about this in our popular imagination sometimes of the Middle Ages. So when I'm interacting with the person who's taking my money on behalf of the monarchy, when I'm interacting with the person who's exerting financial power over my life, when the money is leaving my pocket and going to someone else, the face I see is not of the monarch, not of my local lord, it's of the Jewish person in my town who's been pulled out of the feudal system, right? Jews were made private citizens of a lot of monarchs, and it allowed them to operate in this in-between place. Often anti-Semitism has functioned historically and currently by using Jews as this buffer between folks who are in charge and have a lot of consolidated power and other groups that are also being oppressed or pushed down. So often it looks like, right, if you're on the bottom looking up, you see a Jewish face. If you are behind and able to hide and consolidate power, you're able to use Jews as this buffer community. So we're going to talk about sort of the ways in which that pops up a lot also in American discourse. I just dropped like a lot of information on folks. Why don't we let that settle for a hot second? And the chat is your friend. Folks have
that sounds good. So one question I had following up from that is, I mean, that's a lot of really important historical context. With the interstitiality, because that was a word that was new to me before I spoke with you in preparation for this call, is that something that, is still very present today? Is that kind of something that has continued throughout the history of anti-Semitism, or is that something that we understand more as a historical example?
So glad you asked. Yes, interstitiality is happening all the time. It is likely happening right now in the community. I should say also, Jews are not the only group that experiences this kind of interstitial cyclical type of oppression, but one of the ways that makes it very insidious, or it manifests in a very insidious way, is that often Jewish groups are most vulnerable when they are most proximate to power. That's often when things shift. The CEO of my organization, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, often talks about thinking about interstitiality with the Joseph story. If you're familiar with the Joseph story in Genesis of, we think of Joseph who starts out in prison and then becomes in the Bible, right, the vizier of Pharaoh. He's sort of Pharaoh's right-hand man, this Israelite, not even an Israelite yet, right? This like son of Jacob, this son of Israel living in Egypt. And in some ways, he has a lot of power. He's preventing famine. He's interpreting dreams. He's living in the palace. He also knows the whole time he can immediately be sent back to jail. There's no system of protection for Joseph. He's very proximate to power. He's able to exercise that power. And in some ways, it raises questions on the individual level, less on the communal level, maybe about complicity or about the deals we make with power. But it also means that he's actually still in a very vulnerable position, right? I'm pulling on a totally different myth set here, but like interstitiality and the relationship to power is sort of this sword of Damocles that's often used to push the Jewish community or push Jewish individuals into very compromising situations as a manifestation of their oppression. We can also think about this of the relative safety and level of assimilation that many German Jews felt in the late 1920s and even into the early 1930s in the Weimar Republic. Many Jews thought of themselves as German first in those years, and Jewish second. The Jewish was their religious identity, and it shifted very, very quickly. It becomes very difficult sometimes, even within our community, to identify what danger looks like and what danger feels like, because the ground shifts under our feet. And so it is a great way to partner with the Jewish communities and individual Jews in your life, right? To be sensitive to this dynamic, that the ground is often shifting, and that is on purpose. It's part of the confusion. It's part of what creates the protective obscurity for folks in power who are using this interstitial dynamic even today.
So speaking of ground shifting beneath your feet, that's a really helpful framing and context. That makes me think of something else that we had talked about that I think would be helpful to have some background on before we get back to the American history, is thinking about it as, I think you describe it as like a three-strand braid of anti-Semitism combining economic, political, and religious anti-Semitism. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about that. I think that'll be some really helpful background framing before we dive back into the history.
Absolutely. So why I think it might be helpful to think about this as we move through it as a braid is that each of these strands of these three elements of anti-Semitism or of Jew hatred can be sort of pulled out and identified. And it's helpful to have these three containers, but they're never just showing up by themselves. So we're going to talk about exactly the like racial ethnic components of this, the religious components, the political, under that political, we'll talk about it again, but there's economic, there's national pieces. None of them are ever showing up by themselves, but it's really helpful, I find, to have these boxes to unpack. So when we put it back together and look at specific incidents or specific dynamics in our communities, we can go, oh, this is how 1 and 2 are showing up, or 1 and 3 are showing up, and here's how they're working together. So that's what we're doing. I'm not going to claim that any of these incidents fits neatly into these boxes. However, I think it's useful to go through them. So when I talk about religious Jew hatred, this can be in theology, this can be in practice. We're going to talk later about the difference and dangers of separating out hermeneutic Jews in your religious discourse versus living Jews who live down your street.
Can you explain what that means? I'm not as familiar with that term.
Absolutely. We're gonna come back to it later, I hope, when we talk about strategies and tools. But hermeneutic Jews are the idea of, often in theology, kind of most famously, I think, actually in the theology of Martin Luther, or I'll say very famously in the Jewish understanding and reading of Martin Luther's theology. We're mostly reading for the parts about ourselves. The idea of the hermeneutic Jew, right? I'm using Jewish people as a rhetorical point. I'm not referring to my friend who lives down the street. The Jew, often the figure of like the Jew or the Jewish individual, takes on certain characteristics and a lot of kind of classic Christian theological writing. And sometimes when an author or a theologian was writing about the hermeneutic Jew, he was thinking, okay, this is the same as, Joe Abbott-Bull who lives in my city. And sometimes it's like, oh no, this is a character from the Bible, from the Greek Testament that I'm animating in my head to make a rhetorical point. But the problem is that the hermeneutic Jews may live a full and beautiful and theological, interesting and difficult space, but all of those writings are read by real people, and it often affects legislation, attitudes, interactions that people are having with real Jewish people, whether or not those people have anything to do with the character that appears in theology. So there's that issue. I'll say also,
that's helpful context.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely. Other things, historical, although these are now refuted by the Catholic Church, particularly charges of deicide, the idea that Jewish people in perpetuity were responsible for the death of Jesus and had accepted upon themselves through certain translations of certain gospels. The notion of blood libel, which began in the Middle Ages, first in England, but actually has showed up in the United States, in parts of the Middle East, in parts of Western Asia, very famously in Russia. If you've ever read Bernard Malamud's book, The Fixer, Blood Libel, the idea that Jews are kidnapping young Christian or Muslim children in order to make Passover matzah or to perform desecration of religious symbols of the majority community. These sort of like religiously based, ritually involved conspiracy theories about Jewish communities or Jewish individuals. But also this theological treatment of Jews as a static or a living dead people. The sort of like, if I was to talk about it casually, the zombification of Jews in majority religious cultures and writings and discourse, rather than, excuse me again. All right, we're having some funny pollen things here in Brooklyn today, and they're getting into my throat. So this idea of the zombification of Jews, that Jews are kind of set up to be a symbol or a rhetorical point in a discourse, rather than being a richly evolving group. This can look like, again, some of the theology of Martin Luther of like, once I translate the Greek Testament, you'll just want it and take it and run with it, right? Like that's all you didn't do that? I hate you now. Versus, that's a very casual treatment of a very serious text. I should be clear, I'm like using humor also as my own coping mechanism to talk about a difficult subject and like be in my body as a Jewish woman. I want to be clear, if I'm using humor, it's not to denigrate the subject or that I don't take it seriously. It's actually a tool, we'll talk about more tools later, that lets me stay in this discourse. So it can look like that. It can look like the sort of Augustinian-based theology that Jews are around as a punishment in some way, that like as an example of what happens to non-believers or people who rejected Christ, even though they were witnessing the events of the Gospels, that sort of thing. This can also look a lot more innocuous. This can look like assuming that Jesus participated historically in a rabbinic Jewish Seder, right? A ritual that was developed and concretized hundreds of years after the life of Jesus. But this collapsing of Jews, rather than looking at us in our fullness, our multicultural heritage, the evolution of our thought and our rituals. Anytime that kind of flattening happens, I think is part of the religious Jew hatred. So thinking again,
I don't want to cut you off or jump in too much, but I also am mindful of time and making sure we get to where we want to end today. Can you talk a little bit more about the economic and political strands of the braid through maybe slightly more recent US examples?
Absolutely. So this can look like economic and national concerns in the US context. This can be a lot of conspiracy theories, especially conspiracy theories of a Jewish economic or political cabal, like the theories kind of espoused by Henry Ford or the newspaper, the Dearborn Independent in the 20s, accusations or assumptions of dual loyalty, that Jews are somehow more loyal to each other than to the countries they're living in. I want to note that also has been true around discourse around Catholics. Very famously, right, when JFK was elected, is he going to listen to the Constitution or listen to the Pope? But that dual loyalty accusation. The expulsion of the Jews by Grant during the Civil War. Also more kind of expansive political canards, like what was offered up over the radio by Father Coughlin in the 1930s, the ideas that Jewish bankers were somehow secretly funding Bolshevism in the 1930s, or contemporarily, a lot of the discourse around George Soros today, the idea that one very wealthy, but like individual Jewish man is somehow organizing, right, a whole system and breakdown of an immigration system. These aren't true, but they're very, very powerful, and they have the potential to be very hurtful. A couple of the ethnic racial stereotypes that are particular or more common in the US, they also intersect a lot with both North American and American, particularly gender roles, as well as the history and different movements of Jewish immigration into the United States. But this might come up in stereotypes about Jewish appearances, noses, hair, often really gendered ethnic stereotypes like the overbearing Jewish mother stereotype or the entitled Jewish American princess stereotype. There's also a lot of stereotypes about personality traits that get applied to the entire group, like aggressiveness, materialism, and actually quite a few about sexuality as well. in different communities.
So that's really helpful American historical context. And I know that there's so much more to dive into, but if that kind of brings us up to, where we are today, would you be able to talk a little bit more about what anti-Semitism looks like, feels like, acts like in the US today, and then how that affects you and your Jewish community, if you are willing to share, not just in terms of, attacks that we read about in the newspaper, but maybe in more insidious psychological ways as well?
Absolutely. So a lot of these, pieces of this three-stranded braid show up and work together in ways that can be both violent or really, really threatening to the immediate safety of my community. But like you said, also just insidious and affect interpersonal relationships or even internalized understandings of ourselves. I'm thinking on a really broad scale, like the motivations of the Tree of Life shooter, who allegedly was connecting religious Jewish motivations to help the stranger, those pieces with the hosting of a refugee Shabbat at that synagogue, with white nationalist conspiracy theories about the roles of Jews in immigration issues and in the civil rights movement. But really personally, this in my life where it just shows up can look like having to have really serious conversations about armed guards and security or other community options at synagogues, and especially at preschools. I don't know of another preschool, kind of preschool attached to a religious institution where there's a conversation about, should we have a guard? Should that guard have a firearm? What's our relationship look like practically every weekend with the police, having to unpack a lot of things about physical safety. And again, thinking about internally those questions of interstitiality, what our relationship to our different communities and our neighborhoods are like in terms of that safety. The experience I will also share as a rabbinical student at the time, I think one of the first weeks I had at my internship in Manhattan, the first time I was up at the bima, at the altar to preach and to conduct a service was 2 weeks after the Tree of Life shooting, and standing there realizing I'm facing the door directly. And just having to sort of quickly integrate the terror and like risks that even if no one was outside of my house of worship in that moment, having to integrate that kind of terror and anxiety and, what is the escape plan? What is the safety plan? How do I stay grounded and ready to perform and be with, spiritually with my community and also be thinking about safety. But this can also look like much more mild things. I've been yelled at on the street in places like Boston, places like Washington, D.C., when I wear visibly Jewish items. I cover my hair with a headband, so I get it a little less than folks who wear a kippah or a yarmulke or tzitzit, ritual fringes, but still happens more frequently than you would imagine. Also just assumptions that colleagues make, even other clergy colleagues, when I work at interfaith spaces, remarks that non-Jewish people I may know make about my appearance or assumptions about my finances. I'll say even when I was writing my senior thesis as a theater student initially in university, I had written a play about sort of Jewish observant feminism and ways to hold that. And my advisor, when the end of the reading finished, had no problem, my non-Jewish advisor, getting up and making a joke about, it was too Jewish and he didn't understand. And this is from a man who had Jewish children and had helped me develop the piece and had done all my research with me. But, it can look, I think it can be very surface level, or it can go very, very deep. It can range from the interpersonal, again, to the communal.
I really appreciate you sharing some of your experiences and how anti-Semitism has impacted you. And I'm guessing that, for our Jewish people who are on the call today, the Telos members who are Jewish, that what you're sharing, hits home and rings true for people. And I hope for everybody else on the call who isn't Jewish, that this is a reminder that, we aren't always aware of the way anti-Semitism impacts people on a day-to-day basis. And there's always more to learn about what this looks like for our neighbors, friends, and colleagues in lived reality beyond what we read in the headlines. So really appreciate you sharing with us today. I would love to shift now a little bit from historical context, how to recognize this in the past, all super important in informing the conversation about where we're at today, but would love to learn from you about how we identify anti-Semitism and start to combat it in our own lives, both personally and structurally in our communities.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing that's really important to keep in mind, whether you're on this webinar, any other time you are trying to figure out, even just like what is the Jewish opinion on X, if you have settled on a definite article in that sentence, you are already in trouble. There is a joke in the Jewish community, but I think there's something very true about it, and that's why it's funny, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We are, compared to many other groups in the United States, a very small community, also a very small community globally, that organizes itself often by practice and not necessarily by agreement of religious belief. You could walk inside, I'm ordained by the conservative movement, a conservative Masorti traditional shul, and find synagogue, I should say, that even if people are all praying out of the same prayer book, they often have totally different theologies. They're interpreting those words that they're saying in completely different ways. The homes that they keep in terms of their level and observance and the ways in which they engage with things like kosher or the keeping and practice of Shabbat may look completely different because they organize, and the way that they consider and envision their Jewish identity may be very, very different. Because we're organizing our communities often by shared practice and not necessarily by belief. It's also not as much dogma as in Jewish religion, in the Jewish religious tradition, as there are in other Abrahamic faiths particularly. And I think the way that we often think about religion and faith and identity and ethnicity are sort of very influenced by Protestantism, and particularly North American Protestantism. So this idea that identities fit into these neat categories, and that any one person can represent the whole, I think is already a place to take some pause. So anytime that you're getting something, including on this webinar, know that you're getting a Jewish view, a Jewish perspective, not the Jewish view or the Jewish perspective. But other ways of just thinking about both how to recognize anti-Semitism and combat it. Often people don't realize the history of certain language and conspiracy theories as being really rooted in anti-Semitic tropes. So someone may not even be saying Jewish people or Jews, but they're using these ideas that still really contribute to an environment of discrimination and even less safety sometimes for Jewish people and Jewish communities and other groups connected to them. There are words like coastal elites, globalists, often some conversations, especially today, about Marxism or Bolshevism. Sometimes I find it wait, I thought that political ideology existed 150 years ago, and suddenly everyone's talking about it, and combining it with the language of globalism or elites. That's a good sign that you're actually encountering an anti-Semitic canard. Not 100% of the time, but it's a good thing to sort of clock. We talked earlier about hermeneutic Jews versus your Jewish neighbors. Practically, this can look like in your faith community, noticing how you talk about Pharisees in the Greek Testament, the way in which your community talks about the notion of religious legalism and what you classify as legalism, even the way your community discusses the Hebrew Bible. I have been in a lot of liberal interfaith spaces, loving interfaith spaces, where people from a Christian background will talk about, we have the vengeful, judgeful God of the Old Testament or of the Hebrew Bible, and then we have this liberating and loving God of the Greek Testament or the New Testament. And but the idea of love your neighbor as yourself comes out of Leviticus, but it doesn't track. But when we fall into these patterns, it's a good thing to recognize theologically. Even around the conversation about queer and LGBT rights, often I hear this idea of talking about the legalism piece again, if you're going to go after queer people for the way that they express their attraction to folks, are you also going to not wear mixed fibers? Are you also not going to eat shrimp? And I'll say, I'm a queer woman. My wife is 2 rooms down in our apartment. I don't eat shrimp and I don't wear mixed fibers. This idea that somehow it's a binary, you're actually undermining the lives of queer Jewish people who are living in that intersection all the time when you use that kind of rhetoric for some specific examples. I'd also encourage folks to be really mindful of what you refer to as the Judeo-Christian tradition. Our faiths have text in common, but there's a whole world of Jewish normative interpretation and practice, some of which might align with Christian belief and practice, and a lot of which doesn't. And even when it's aligned, it's not necessarily shared. to think about why are you making the rhetorical point, often either to collapse and squish together Judaism and Christianity as their practice in 2021, sometimes to exclude Muslim or other groups from that conversation, or why it feels rhetorically important to link into a Jewish community. And are you, again, talking about a flattened or ahistorical Jewish community, or are you claiming common cause and interest with the Jews who are living and experiencing and praying around you? Also, I think just with the way that our US curriculum, certainly the public school curriculum I was exposed to as a kid, was set up, there I would really love to see more awareness and understanding that Jew hatred did not begin or end with the Holocaust. In some ways, the Holocaust pulled on long-standing tropes and ideas about Jews and traditions of Jew hatred. And in some ways, it was a completely new, that's part of, among many reasons why it's so horrifying, just a totally previously unthought of mechanized level of murder, not just of Jewish people, but also Roma and Sinti people, a number of other groups, both religious and ethnic and political groups, but that somehow either with the end of the Holocaust that anti-Semitism was solved, or that anti-Semitism didn't exist prior to the Holocaust. A teacher I really love and respect, once says by way of illustration, if you had gone to people 150 years before the Holocaust or the Shoah and asked Jews of Europe and North Africa, it's very important to remember, right? The Holocaust spread to places like Iraq, like Libya. There are concentration camps in Libya, in Libya and in Greece even, that if you would ask people, this is going to happen, where do you think it would happen? People would be much, much more likely to have said France 100 or 150 years before than Germany. It's that ground shifting under our feet that is part of why that moment is so horrifying, but it is not the beginning or end of that experience. I think those are the pieces I would hope folks would take away.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt. This is all really helpful. So then shifting to what we do when we encounter anti-Semitism, I think I want to ask this in two ways. One, do you have tools or suggestions for folks how we should respond when we encounter anti-Semitism? And then two, tools or suggestions for folks about how we proactively work to prevent and counter anti-Semitism before it happens?
Absolutely. And I think here's the place where I feel really encouraged by a telos approach that so returns to self-interrogation and to agency, right? It's really easy, I think, for people of all faith and ethnic backgrounds to feel really overwhelmed confronting something that shifts, that is very, very old, that seems to find new ways to manifest every 5 minutes. But the actually grounding ourselves in our agency and grounding ourselves not just in analysis, but relationships, I think is so essential. The number one thing you can do, I think, when something happens in your community that is anti-Semitic is pick up the phone and call, not just one rabbi, not just a representative, reach out to your friends and your neighbors, ask them how they're experiencing it. Make sure you're getting a multiplicity of voices is a big piece of it, I think.
That's
as well
really
as that kind of continued theological self-interrogation, looking at in what ways is this showing up. I think also listening to the words under the words, right? Often the way that anti-Semitism manifests contemporarily, you don't even need to say Jews or Jewish people under, like, if there's a conspiracy theory, whether it's, the kind of thing my little brother hears about in high school, hearing about like, oh, the Illuminati, to, a global cabal protecting foreign interests. So really good, should be a trigger for interrogation of like, in what ways is this showing up in the political discourse that I'm part of, in the community discourse that I'm part of?
No, that's all really important. And it brings to mind to me too, that when people let us know that we have done something wrong, or we have maybe unintentionally been anti-Semitic, that intent doesn't negate impact, that is where we do need to be invited into doing more self-interrogation, that people aren't letting us know that we've unwittingly perpetuated an anti-Semitic trope or conspiracy theory, or even in our theology, but that it's an invitation to learn more about where that's come from and what we can do to not keep recreating those tropes moving forward. I think that that's a really important part of what I'm going to take away from everything you are saying as well. Anything else, Rabbi Margo, that you want to say before we shift to some audience questions, where I'm sure we'll continue the conversation and pick up on different threads of this?
I'm happy to shift to questions.
Okay, well, I think a good one to start with comes from Micah, and he's asking, what is the question about Israel and anti-Semitism that you think is most important for us to be asking, and how would you answer it?
One piece that I feel really gets left out, and I'm moving here from an American context to an international point of view, is not, how do we go to with that fine tooth comb and unpack, is an anti-Israel sentiment or statement or action the same or similar or related to an anti-Semitic one? But where is the sensitivity historically coming from? What has happened in the last century or less that is causing this gut reaction, or that, like, where is the emotion coming from, right? This is me putting on my pastoral hat or my pastoral yarmulke or headband, as well as my scholarly one. I think that there's not enough awareness about the way in which Jews who are not related to a Zionist political ideology have been labeled Zionist, not so much in the United States, but in other countries, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in a way that has enacted a lot of violence in their communities. I'm thinking particularly in the 50s, there was a very wealthy Iraqi businessman, his name escapes me in this moment, who was a member of the Jewish community, who was accused, even though he was avowedly secular and also avowedly apolitical, but who was accused and tried for somehow being affiliated with the government of the state of Israel, and he was publicly executed. And it started sort of a mass panic understandably in the Iraqi Jewish community about their safety, right? This was the most well-known member of the Iraqi Jewish business community. And he was functionally lynched after a show trial in the 1950s after accusations of that. And the Iraqi government at the time carried it out saying, we're being anti-Zionist. It has nothing to do with the fact that he's Jewish. This man had no relationship to a Zionist political ideology. Similarly, thinking about the doctor's plot in the USSR, right, where a number of Communist Party officials in Russia who were Jewish, who initially thought that they were fine, they had assimilated, they were not practicing the Jewish religion, were accused of the leader of their country of being somehow allied with a Zionist political project they had nothing to do with. I would love to see more awareness, both in the Jewish community and outside of it, about the way in which so often this discourse never even touches the individuals that are being talked about. Often, like the politics certainly can't take a back seat because they're animating the discussion, but where that fear comes from and the actual violence that's been associated in the last 50 to 100 years outside of anywhere in the Middle East or outside of specifically Israel, Palestine, sort of adjacent to this discussion. I feel like that's often a piece that's really missing for folks.
That's really important. I haven't thought a whole lot about that myself. And I think I'm going to have to spend some time wrestling with what you have just shared and thinking about ways I don't always see that when I look at this discourse or these types of conversations. Before I bring up the next question, I'd love to have you speak just a little bit about your role with Trua and what Trua is as an organization. I think it's really important for us to also hear about your work with them to understand a little bit more about, how you and how Trua approach Israel, Palestine, and American Jewish identity all in one conversation.
Absolutely. So that could be its own webinar. Yes. I would refer for more in-depth explanation. I would refer folks to all the fabulous information that is kept by our Director of Communications on our website to flesh this out. But on one foot, if I could tell you the whole story while sitting on one foot, Trua is the rabbinic call for human rights. We use the word rabbinic. We also work with cantors, so Jewish clergy more broadly, but we organize and mobilize Jewish clergy around human rights issues in North America, in Israel, Palestine, and in the occupied territories. So we're involved in a number of national coalitions. And a lot of my work particularly is working to expand our capacity in the New York area. Our national office is based there, but now we're building out a wider sort of capacity to work with New York rabbis and cantors to get more involved in social justice issues, especially where they overlap, particularly through a human rights lens. So my work in a day can look like talking about inter-Jewish community issues, but it can also be mobilizing rabbis and cantors of all different backgrounds and conversations about ending mass incarceration, about farm worker workers' rights and thinking seriously about where our food comes from and how the people who pick and process that food are treated. I'm just thinking about phone calls I'm having later today. It can look like partnering both with other Jewish groups, other faith groups, and even secular groups in support of certain kinds of legislation that dovetail with our human rights mission. In a nutshell, that's what we do.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think my colleague Sharon put the Trua link into the website in the chat. So if you're interested in checking that out, I'd encourage everyone to follow that link to go and look at the work Trua is doing online. So, as we were talking about what we want to talk about today, I know I said I was not going to put you on the spot. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to answer, like for yourself or for Trua. And I know especially, sometimes when conversations are fresh, it's helpful to have them as a community and not as a community publicly. So Abigail's wondering if you would be willing to comment on Ben and Jerry's recent statement that they will no longer be in the occupied territories and how that relates to the fight against anti-Semitism. And again, if you'd rather not talk about that, if that's a conversation you're still having internally, that's absolutely fine. If not, Abigail would love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. What I think might be most helpful in terms of what's missing in the discourse is actually, Trua's statement on this is available on our website and also on our Twitter. Our media people are so fast, they're incredible. But it's actually described pieces of the argument that I think are getting lost. So BDS, or the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, is a nonviolent calling for boycotting, divesting, sanctioning from, as I understand it, products in all of Israel. Ben & Jerry's is saying they're looking at and renewing their licensing agreement at the end of the year, right? And talking about whether or not their products will be available in settlements, areas of the West Bank that are over internationally recognized borders, where there are settler citizens of Israel living in the West Bank. So the conflation, I think, of this conversation with the BDS conversation is one that we then be like, many people I think are quick to conflate these two, but I think it's actually really important that we get very specific in our terms. I think, to my understanding, folks who are in support of BDS, which Trua does not endorse, are actually quite frustrated with Ben & Jerry's in this moment, because that's not the political path that they're taking or the economic path that they are taking. I think it is really important to specify that criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. Israel is a nation state and should be held to, the same standards of human rights that every other country in the world is. What I have appreciated is that Ben & Jerry's has not only pulled their products out of the West Bank, right? They also no longer sell in Hong Kong and in Russia in response to the major human rights violations happening there. At the same time, they are a brand that markets itself as socially conscious, but I am much more interested in hearing also what's happening, not just in sort of a discussion around capital and not just organizations, but for-profit businesses, because I think that, right, those are often shifting in response to what's happening on the ground, what activists, especially human rights activists, are already pushing for within Israel-Palestine. But there's more information about that also online.
Wonderful. I appreciate you answering. And I want to pick up on the piece you mentioned about that critique of Israel isn't always anti-Semitic, that there has to be a way to have this nuanced conversation. A question we had submitted through the registration form that I think picks up on this is, I think often when people are wading into Israel-Palestine, and with Telos, our approach is to be pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. That's sometimes a tricky thing to communicate to others, or a hard line to navigate when people are very used to being pro-one, anti-another. What would you say, or do you have advice for people who are maybe wading into the waters of how to have a more nuanced conversation about Israel, are met with accusations that they are anti-Semitic for critiquing Israel at all, and then still want to talk about fundamental human rights for Jews, for Israelis, for Palestinians, but also are very sensitive to the fact that they do not want to be anti-Semitic and are maybe wrestling with what it means to legitimately critique while also wanting to make sure that doing the self-interrogation and taking, accusations of anti-Semitism seriously enough?
Make sure that you're in conversation with not just one or two Jewish people or one or two Jewish communities, but really, as much as you can, I think, engaging with the breadth and depth of the discourse, so you can understand where your comments are resonating and where they are hurting. I think both because increasingly, because of the pandemic and also just sort of the saturation in our lives of social media, right? it is very hard to have these conversations in a nuanced way on the internet. And yet the internet is the way to connect with the most amount of people, have access to all of these different perspectives. But I think be mindful of your sources. Make sure that you're not making pronouncements in a vacuum. If you feel that you've got one Jewish voice like really hard signing off on what you have to say, I would check it against 2 or 3 others if your goal is to understand and your primary accountability is to the Jewish community. At the same time, there are lots of people who are involved in this work in very good faith, many of whom I'm partnered with, whose primary mechanisms of accountability aren't to the Jewish community. And I think that's another place, where there's that opportunity for not just self-reflection and self-interrogation, but also taking the impetus to build relationships and to be in conversation. And like you said earlier, remember, inevitably you're going to hurt people. I think there's just no way to touch something that is this hot and this essential. For me, as spiritual work, and also for many of us as political work, as human rights work, without causing pain. But I think remembering that when someone shares that with you, it's an invitation into conversation. It's an invitation to dialogue. If we can, instead of shutting down and saying like, well, I'm never talking about it again, and I'm never getting involved, in Israeli-Palestinian human rights issues ever again, and instead say, someone told me I messed up. What a good measure of the depth of relationship I've already built. How fortunate am I that somebody trusts me to tell me that they are feeling hurt? It's an opportunity for repair. In Hebrew, I would call it teshuvah, the ability, or tikkun, like to put back together or even to draw closer. I think is really, really essential. To don't let criticism be the end of a conversation.
Absolutely. Another one of Telos's principles of peacemaking is that authentic relationships across lines of difference fuels transformation, which supports exactly what you just said about the importance of going out and forming genuine relationship with Jewish communities or other people across lines of difference to fuel that transformation, to have those challenging conversations, to be held accountable, and to grow in community with the orientation towards, the fact that a just peace has to be one that takes seriously everybody's flourishing. And that means listening to critique about what we're doing a lot of the time. I want to ask Tan's question next. She says, as a college student, how can I navigate and address anti-Semitism properly on campus, either through legislation or discourse? What vital aspects do you think is missing or is needed about education, or is needed in education about anti-Semitism in schools?
I think the conversation about like anti-Semitism on campus actually really started to heat up when I was in undergrad. And I think there's a lot of different pieces. So I would encourage you to like take which of these that feel useful. When I was organizing on campus around anti-Semitism, both within a context related to Israel or Jewish self-determination, and often with, outside of that, remembering that one of the challenges I think of university work specifically, but not always in an undergraduate field, even with people who are doing longer term degrees, is the lack of institutional memory, often within a student body. Know that like talking to your administrators, you're also going to encounter all of their biases and all of their wants to like, keep campus discourse in a certain place, but it's also a really good research tool to figure out what happened before I got here. Where are the wounds already? If you can sort of do, from an organizing perspective, right, a power map of the different student groups so that you know sort of where you're hitting before you engage in discourse, I think you can feel a lot more empowered. I think pieces that are missing, I can really only speak, I think, to my undergraduate experience, but I also just did a round of consulting at Brown University through their Narrow Bridge project, is I think the relationship piece and the emotional piece. I think campuses are certainly, it's the place where I learned and grew initial principles and tools of how to be an activist. But keeping in mind also that this is a space for a lab. College is a place to go to like hit your brain really hard against some stuff and to feel hurt and to grow from that, at least in an intellectual, but also an emotional space. If you're constantly seeking the space of safety where everyone is agreeing with you and everyone is reifying the ideology that you've walked in with, you are likely going to like have a lot of discourse and be very deep in that vein. And that depth is important, but remembering to have a breadth across campus is really, really helpful. I also think cross-campus organizing is essential to be having these conversations. Every school is its own microcosm and is kind of a bubble, but I think it's really helpful to be able to take the bird's eye view and figure out what's happening. The third thing that feels really essential to me is being mindful of these tropes and being mindful of how specific students are targeted: Israeli students, Jewish students, Muslim students, Palestinian students, Christian students, the way in which, and so many more, all of us are being drawn often into this discourse, and not kind of doing the gut check of, okay, before I put out this flyer, am I engaging in traditional anti-Semitic tropes? Even thinking, there may need to be a tactic that works great discussing, a different human rights issue. You want to go in with the awareness of, where is the potential minefield? Where is the opportunity to kind of step on a piece of trauma that's going to activate a shutdown rather than open up an opportunity for discourse? But I also think that there's space to build up like an emotional resilience in this work also. I think if we're looking to, at the end of the day, feel totally heard and totally validated and not have our feelings hurt, I think that's a really good space to be in a communal healing space. I would say, but cultivating emotional resilience as activists and as people who are engaged in this work is really, really essential. There's a little bit of breakage, I think, that it comes with engaging in this work honestly and openly and in a spiritually vulnerable way. And I think being prepared and ready to integrate that is actually really, really essential.
Thank you so much for that answer and for all of the answers. We're right just at time now, and as we don't have any other questions in the chat, I think we'll start wrapping up. But I really want to thank you, Rabbi Margo, for being here with us today to take some time to teach us about anti-Semitism, past, present, where we need to be more aware of it in our lives, how we can start to combat it. I know that has to be, hard to always think about Jewish hatred or violence against Jews when you also want to spend so much of your time and energy, right, just living Jewish life and celebrating Jewish joy. So I'm really appreciative of the fact that you took the time to come and educate us all today. And thank you everybody else for joining us for this webinar. Hope you all learned something. Hope you leave self-interrogating and thinking about ways to advocate in your own communities around combating anti-Semitism. We'd love to see you again at our next event. We've got one coming up July 27th. It's a screening of Just Vision's My Neighborhood. And then also an info station on how to become a Telos Table host also on July 27th. The Telos Tables program, I might be slightly biased because I'm very involved with it, but it's a great way to keep having these types of conversations with your local communities oriented towards action. So if you're looking for more ways to get involved, I'd encourage you to check that out and join us for that. Otherwise, follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, check out Trua, go follow all the wonderful work they're doing, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to meet y'all.
Thanks.